The candles on the long dinner table flickered as the soup was served, and nobody noticed the young woman standing just outside the doorway, close enough to hear every word spoken inside. Eleanor Hartley had come to deliver a message from her father, a small note about a shipment of cloth, and the butler had told her to wait there until the family finished their first course. She had not meant to listen, but the voice of Duke Alexander Whitmore carried easily across the marble floor, sharp and certain, the voice of a man who never once thought anyone beneath him could hear him speak. "She is not worth noticing," Alexander said to his younger brother Julian, setting down his glass with a small, careless clink. "I do not understand why you continue to entertain the idea of marrying her. She has no title, no fortune, and frankly, no presence. A man in your position could do so much better." Julian, seated across from him, opened his mouth to protest, but the Duke continued before he could speak. "Eleanor Hartley is a merchant's daughter, Julian. Her father sells cloth. Sells it, mind you, like a common tradesman. When she walks into a room, no one turns their head. When she speaks, no one remembers what she said 5 minutes later. She is forgettable, and you would tie our family name to someone forgettable." Outside the door, Eleanor stood perfectly still, her hand pressed flat against the cool stone wall, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that the Whitmore family did not think highly of her. She had felt it in the way servants glanced at her when she entered the great house, in the way distant relatives at gatherings looked past her rather than at her. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so cruelly, by the very man whose approval could make or break her future with Julian, was a different kind of pain entirely. She did not cry. She would not allow herself that, not standing in a hallway where anyone might walk past and see her. Instead, she folded the note in her hand into a small, tight square, turned on her heel, and walked out of the house without waiting to be acknowledged by anyone. The night air outside was cold, and it slapped against her cheeks as she walked down the long gravel path toward the road where her carriage waited. Her driver, an older man named Edward who had worked for her family for many years, took one look at her face and said nothing, only opened the door and helped her inside. As the carriage rolled away from the Whitmore estate, Eleanor stared out the window at the darkened fields passing by, and something inside her began to shift. It was not sadness anymore. It was something colder, something sharper. She thought of every dinner she had attended at that house, every polite smile she had offered to people who barely looked at her, every time she had shrunk herself smaller so as not to offend anyone with too much presence. She thought of her own father, working late into the night over ledgers that never seemed to balance, trying to keep their family business from collapsing under the weight of debts he rarely spoke of. She was not worth noticing. Fine. She would make sure that one day the entire country noticed her, whether the Duke liked it or not. Word of the broken engagement spread through the social circles of the county within a matter of days. Julian, caught between his brother's disapproval and his own uncertain feelings, did not fight for Eleanor the way she had hoped he might. He sent a letter, brief and formal, explaining that given the circumstances, it would be best if they did not continue their courtship. He did not mention his brother by name, but Eleanor knew exactly where the decision had come from. She read the letter once, standing in the small study of her family home, surrounded by shelves of books her father had collected over the years. Then she folded it, just as she had folded the note outside the dining room, and placed it inside a drawer she rarely opened. Her mother, a gentlewoman named Margaret, who had watched her daughter grow from a curious, clever child into a poised young woman, found her there an hour later, still standing by the same shelf. "You are not crying," Margaret said softly, coming to stand beside her. "No," Eleanor answered. "I do not think I will cry over this." "You loved him." "I thought I did," Eleanor said, and for the first time that evening, her voice wavered slightly. "But I think what I loved was the idea that someone from a family like that might see me as more than what I am. I think I wanted proof that I mattered to people who did not think people like us mattered at all." Margaret took her daughter's hand. "And now?" Eleanor turned to face her mother, and there was something new in her expression, something Margaret had never quite seen before. It was not anger, not exactly. It was resolve. "Now I am going to matter, whether they decide to notice me or not," Eleanor said. "I am tired of waiting for permission to be seen." The following weeks were quiet ones, at least on the surface. Eleanor continued to help her father with the family trade, reviewing correspondence, checking figures, visiting the small warehouse where bolts of cloth sat stacked from floor to ceiling. But underneath that quiet surface, her mind was working constantly, turning over ideas, questioning why things were done the way they had always been done. Her father, a soft-spoken man named Henry Hartley, had built his cloth trading business decades earlier, and it had once been prosperous. But in recent years, cheaper materials from larger manufacturers had begun to eat away at his profits, and he had grown tired, both in body and in spirit, from trying to keep the business afloat. He often worked late into the night, and Eleanor had grown accustomed to bringing him tea and sitting with him while he muttered over columns of numbers that refused to add up in his favor. One evening, as she sat across from him in his study, she noticed something in the ledgers that caught her attention. The mill that supplied much of their raw material, a modest textile operation on the edge of town, was struggling far worse than her father's own business. Its owner, an aging man with no children to inherit the operation, had let the machinery fall into disrepair and had lost several of his most skilled workers to larger factories in the city. "Father," Eleanor said, setting down her teacup, "what would happen if someone bought the mill and ran it properly, not just as a supplier, but as its own business, selling directly, rather than through so many middlemen?" Henry looked up at her, surprised by the question. It would take a great deal of money to repair the machinery, and a great deal of knowledge about how to manage workers, negotiate fair wages, secure new contracts. It is not a task for the faint of heart, Eleanor. "I am not faint of heart," she said simply. Her father studied her for a long moment, the way he used to study her when she was a child asking questions far beyond her years. "You have been thinking about this for some time, haven't you?" "Ever since the night I stood outside a dining room and heard a man declare that I was not worth noticing," Eleanor said. "I have decided that if no one is going to notice me for who I already am, then I will simply have to become someone impossible to ignore." Henry set down his pen slowly. He had heard, through the quiet channels that carried news among the merchant families, about what had happened at the Whitmore estate. He had said nothing to his daughter about it, waiting for her to bring it up in her own time. Now that she had, he found himself both proud and worried in equal measure. "It will not be easy," he warned her. "Men in this trade do not take kindly to a woman stepping into matters they consider their own. You will face resistance at every turn. People will doubt you before you have even opened your mouth to speak." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I would rather fail at something I chose for myself than succeed at being quietly overlooked for the rest of my life." There was a small inheritance left to her by her grandmother, money that had sat untouched in a modest account for years, meant for a wedding that would now never take place. Eleanor decided, after many sleepless nights of calculation and careful thought, that it would serve a far better purpose funding her own ambitions than sitting idle, waiting for a future she no longer wanted. She visited the owner of the struggling mill herself, a man named Arthur Bellamy, who greeted her with the polite but dismissive courtesy so many men extended to young women who wandered into matters of business. He assumed, at first, that she had come on behalf of her father, perhaps to discuss a delay in shipment or a change in an order. "I have come to discuss purchasing your mill," Eleanor said plainly, once she was seated across from him in his cluttered office. Arthur blinked at her, clearly caught off guard. "You wish to purchase the mill? On whose behalf?" "My own," she said. "I have the funds to make a fair offer, and I believe, with the proper investment and management, this mill could become profitable again within a year." Arthur laughed, not unkindly, but with the tired amusement of a man who had heard many ambitious promises over the years, and watched most of them crumble. "Miss Hartley, with all due respect, running a textile mill is not a simple matter. There are machines to repair, workers to manage, contracts to negotiate. It is not a task suited to someone of your experience." "With all due respect to you as well," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "Your mill has lost nearly half its workers in the last 2 years. Your machinery has not been properly maintained since before your wife passed. And your largest remaining contract is set to expire within the next 4 months, after which you will have no buyers left at all. I do not say this to insult you, Mr. Bellamy. I say it because I have studied your accounts, through the records shared with my father's business, and I understand precisely what state this mill is in. I am offering you a way out of a situation that will only worsen with time. Arthur stared at her for a long moment, his earlier amusement fading into something closer to respect, mixed with a healthy dose of surprise. Few people, man or woman, spoke to him with such direct clarity about the failing state of his business. You have clearly done your research, he said finally. I intend to do a great deal more before I am finished, Eleanor answered. It took several weeks of negotiation, several more meetings than Eleanor had anticipated, and no small amount of stubborn persistence. But by the end of that season, the mill belonged to her. She signed the final papers in Arthur's cluttered office, her hand steady despite the enormous weight of what she was undertaking. Walking out of that building for the first time as its owner, Eleanor stood on the cobblestone street outside and looked up at the tired brick structure before her, its windows grimy, its chimney silent for want of proper fuel and functioning equipment. It did not look like the beginning of anything remarkable. It looked, if anything, like a building on the verge of collapse. But Eleanor did not see it that way. She saw possibility in every crack in the mortar, every broken pane of glass, every silent, unused machine inside. She saw a future that belonged entirely to her, built from nothing but her own determination, and the sting of 5 cruel words spoken over a dinner she had not been invited to share. That night, she wrote a single line in a small leather journal she had begun keeping, a journal that would, over the following months, fill with plans, figures, and quiet reflections on everything she was about to build. She is not worth noticing, the Duke had said. Eleanor read the words back to herself once, then closed the journal and looked out toward the horizon, where the first mill she would ever own stood waiting for her, silent and full of promise. She had no way of knowing, on that quiet evening, just how far those words would carry her, or how completely they would return, one day, to the very man who had spoken them. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the mill before the sun had fully risen. She wanted to walk through every room herself, to understand exactly what she had taken on, rather than relying only on the figures written in ledgers. She brought with her a notebook, a lantern, and a determination that had not left her since the night at the Whitmore estate. The main floor of the mill stretched out before her, rows of looms standing silent and coated in dust, their wooden frames worn smooth by years of use and then years of neglect. She ran her hand along one of the machines, feeling the grooves where countless hands before her had worked to keep the operation running. Somewhere beneath the dust and disrepair, she could sense the bones of something that had once worked well and could work well again. A handful of remaining workers arrived shortly after her, cautious and uncertain about what their new ownership might mean for them. Eleanor gathered them together in the main room and spoke to them plainly, the same way she had spoken to Arthur Bellamy. I know this mill has struggled, she said, standing before a group of tired, wary faces. I know many of you have gone without proper wages, for longer than you should have. I am not here to make promises I cannot keep, but I am here to tell you that I intend to fix what is broken, starting with the machines, and continuing with fair and timely pay for every person who works here. If you are willing to give me a chance to prove that, I would be glad to have you stay. There was silence for a long moment. Then an older worker, a woman named Charlotte, who had spent nearly 20 years at the mill, stepped forward. You truly mean to run this place yourself? Charlotte asked, studying Eleanor with sharp, assessing eyes. I do, Eleanor answered. Charlotte glanced around at her fellow workers, then back at Eleanor. Then we will give you your chance, Miss Hartley. Goodness knows this mill could not get much worse than it already is. A few quiet laughs broke the tension in the room, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since that terrible night at the Whitmore dinner table, something close to hope beginning to take root inside her chest. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the work, with a focus that surprised even her father. She spent her mornings studying the mechanics of the looms, teaching herself enough to understand what repairs were needed, and hiring skilled workmen to carry them out properly. She spent her afternoons meeting with fabric buyers across the region, slowly rebuilding the network of contracts that had withered under Arthur's declining management. And she spent her evenings poring over the ledgers, determined to understand every shilling that came in and went out, refusing to let the business slip into the same careless disorder that had nearly destroyed it before. It was not easy. There were setbacks, delays in shipments of new parts for the machinery, disagreements with suppliers who doubted her ability to honor contracts, and long nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her resolve entirely. But every time she felt her strength wavering, she thought back to that dining room, to the sound of Alexander Whitmore's voice, declaring her unworthy of notice, and something inside her hardened into steel all over again. By the time the first repaired looms roared back to life, filling the mill with the steady, rhythmic clatter of true production once more, Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched with tears finally slipping down her cheeks. Tears, not of sadness this time, but of something far more powerful. She had built this, piece by piece, from nothing but stubbornness and a broken heart that had refused to stay broken. She did not yet know how far this small victory would carry her. She did not know that within a year, whispers of a remarkable businesswoman transforming a failing mill into one of the finest textile operations in the region would begin traveling far beyond the borders of her own quiet town. She did not know that those whispers would eventually reach the ears of the very family that had once dismissed her so completely. All she knew, standing in that doorway with the machines humming steadily behind her, was that she was no longer the same woman who had stood frozen in a hallway, listening to cruel words meant for someone else's ears. She had become someone entirely new, someone built from her own determination, rather than anyone else's approval. And she intended to keep building, no matter what stood in her way. A carriage crashed through the front gate of the mill grounds, its wheels splintering against the stone post, and Eleanor rushed outside to find her supplier's youngest son bleeding from a cut above his eye, gasping that the shipment of dye they desperately needed had been seized at the border over a paperwork dispute. There was no time to panic, there was only time to act, and Eleanor had learned, over the past year, exactly how to do both at once. It had been 12 months since she signed the papers that made the mill hers, and in that time, the quiet, overlooked young woman who once stood frozen in a hallway had become someone entirely different. She wrapped a cloth around the boy's wound, sent for the doctor, and within the hour had already drafted 3 separate letters, one to the customs office demanding clarification, one to an alternate supplier requesting an emergency shipment, and one to her lawyer, asking him to review the original contract for any clause that might resolve the dispute quickly. She did not waste time wringing her hands. She solved problems, one after another, the way she had trained herself to do since the night everything changed. The mill itself had transformed almost beyond recognition. Where once dust-coated silent machines, now the main floor rang, with the steady rhythm of dozens of working looms, tended by a workforce that had grown from a handful of tired, uncertain employees to nearly 60 skilled workers, many of whom had come from neighboring towns after hearing of the fair wages and steady, respectful management offered under Eleanor's ownership. Charlotte, the older worker who had first agreed to give Eleanor a chance, now served as the floor supervisor, overseeing daily operations with a sharp eye and a fierce loyalty to the woman who had rebuilt this place from near ruin. She often told newer workers, when they doubted whether Eleanor truly understood the business as well as she claimed, that she had never in 20 years of textile work met an owner who studied the machines, the accounts, and the market with such relentless dedication. "She does not ask us to do anything she has not first tried to understand herself," Charlotte would say. "That is more than I can say for most who have run this place before her." The quality of cloth produced at the mill had become known throughout the county for its consistency and its craftsmanship, a reputation Eleanor had built deliberately, refusing to cut corners, even when cheaper, lower-quality thread might have increased her short-term profits. She understood something that many larger manufacturers seem to have forgotten in their rush toward faster, cheaper production, that a reputation built on quality would always outlast one built on speed. But success, as Eleanor was quickly learning, brought its own set of challenges. Larger textile operations, threatened by the sudden rise of a small mill run by a woman with no formal training in business, began to view her with open hostility. Contracts that had once seemed secure were suddenly contested. Suppliers who had happily done business with her for months began finding excuses to delay shipments or raise prices without warning. It did not take long for Eleanor to understand that some of her competitors, uncomfortable with her rapid success, were actively working to undermine her. The seized dye shipment, she suspected almost immediately, was no accident of bureaucracy. Someone had reported an irregularity in the paperwork that did not actually exist, hoping to tie up her production long enough to cost her several important contracts she had spent months carefully negotiating. She confronted the situation the way she confronted every obstacle that had come before it, with clear thinking rather than panic. Within 2 days, she had secured an emergency shipment of dye from an alternate supplier in a neighboring county, paying a premium price but ensuring her production schedule remained intact. She also sent a carefully worded letter to the customs office, one that combined polite formality with an unmistakable undertone of legal seriousness, and within a week, the original shipment was released, along with a quiet apology for what the office described as a clerical misunderstanding. Eleanor never discovered with absolute certainty who had orchestrated the interference, though she had her suspicions. A larger textile company based in the city, one that had recently lost a significant contract to her mill due to her competitive pricing and superior craftsmanship, had grown increasingly vocal in local trade circles about what its owner called the reckless disruption caused by inexperienced newcomers entering an established market. Rather than allow the incident to frighten her into caution, Eleanor used it as motivation to expand even further. She began exploring opportunities beyond her local region, reaching out to buyers in London itself, a market she had once considered far beyond her reach. She understood that the more her business grew, the harder it would become for anyone to interfere with it through petty tricks and manufactured complications. Her father, watching his daughter navigate these challenges with a composure that both amazed and worried him, often reminded her to be cautious. "You are moving quickly, Eleanor," Henry said one evening, as they reviewed the latest shipment records together in his study. "Perhaps too quickly. There is wisdom in building slowly, in securing what you have before reaching for more." "I have spent my entire life being cautious, Father," Eleanor replied. "I was cautious with my words, cautious with my ambitions, cautious with everything, because I believed that being careful and quiet was what made a person respectable, and it earned me nothing but a man declaring, in front of his brother, that I was not worth noticing. I do not intend to be cautious anymore." Henry studied his daughter for a long moment, a mixture of pride and worry evident in his tired eyes. "Just promise me, you will not lose yourself in the process of proving them wrong." "I am not trying to prove anyone wrong," Eleanor said, though, even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "I am trying to build something that matters. If it happens to prove certain people wrong along the way, I will not complain." Her expansion into the London market proved more difficult than she had anticipated, though not for lack of demand for her products. Buyers in the city, upon learning that the fine, consistently woven cloth they had been admiring came from a mill owned and operated by a young unmarried woman, often reacted with a mixture of curiosity and outright skepticism. Several refused to meet with her at all, insisting on dealing only with a male representative, a role Eleanor eventually filled by hiring a capable young man named Nathaniel Cross, whom she trained thoroughly and sent to negotiate contracts on her behalf, while she continued managing the actual operations of the mill from behind the scenes. It was not the arrangement she wanted. She wanted to walk into those meetings herself, to speak for her own work rather than allowing someone else to represent it. But she also understood, with the same clear practicality that had guided every decision she made since taking over the mill, that securing contracts mattered more than her own pride in this particular moment. There would be time, later, to demand recognition on her own terms. For now, her priority remained the survival and growth of everything she had built. Nathaniel proved himself a capable representative, sharp enough to negotiate favorable terms, and honest enough that Eleanor never worried he might attempt to claim credit for work that was not truly his own. Within a few months, the mill had secured 3 significant contracts with London buyers, contracts that nearly doubled its production output and required Eleanor to hire an additional 20 workers to keep pace with demand. The mill's reputation continued to spread, carried through the quiet channels of trade gossip that moved between merchants, buyers, and manufacturers across the region. People began speaking of a mysterious operation, known simply by the name Eleanor had chosen for it, Hartley and Bellamy Textiles, a name that honored both her own family and the man who had trusted her with his failing business when few others believed she could succeed. Few people who spoke of the mill's remarkable transformation connected it, at first, to the quiet young woman who had once been quietly dismissed by one of the county's most prominent families. Eleanor had deliberately kept her personal history separate from her professional reputation, understanding that many people would judge her business less fairly if they knew the full story of how it began. But rumors, no matter how carefully managed, have a way of eventually finding their way to unexpected ears. and in the grand estates of the county's wealthiest families, where gossip traveled just as quickly as it did among merchants and tradesmen. Whispers of the remarkable Miss Hartley and her thriving mill had already begun to circulate, though none of the Whitmore family had yet made the connection between this rising businesswoman and the young woman once dismissed at their own dinner table. That connection would not remain hidden for much longer. Eleanor stood on the mill floor one evening, watching the last of the day's workers file out into the cool evening air, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling in equal measure across her face. Charlotte approached her, wiping her hands on her apron, a rare smile softening her usually stern expression. "We have exceeded last month's production numbers again," Charlotte said. "At this rate, we will need to expand the building itself within the year." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Then we will expand it." "You have built something remarkable here, Miss Hartley," Charlotte said, studying her employer with genuine warmth. "I do not think you fully understand yet just how remarkable it truly is." Eleanor looked around at the mill, at the machines, standing quiet now in the evening light, at the walls that had once been crumbling and were now solid and freshly repaired, at everything she had built from nothing but stubbornness and a broken engagement that had felt, at the time, like the end of everything she had hoped for. "I am beginning to understand," Eleanor said softly, "but I still have a great deal further to go." She did not yet know that fate, in the form of a business summit hosted by the very family that had once dismissed her, was already preparing to bring her face to face with the man whose careless words had set this entire remarkable journey into motion. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with a wax stamp Eleanor did not recognize, and the moment Nathaniel Cross placed it on her desk, she felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness settle in her chest. It was an invitation, formally worded, addressed to Hartley and Bellamy Textiles, requesting the presence of its principal representative at a trade summit to be hosted at the Whitmore estate the following month. Eleanor set the letter down and stared at it for a long moment, before picking it up again to read it a second time, certain she must have misunderstood something. But the words remained the same. The Whitmore family, unaware that the mysterious and increasingly respected mill they wished to court for a shipping partnership belonged to the very woman one of their own had dismissed as unworthy of notice, was inviting her to their home. She almost laughed at the strange, cruel humor of it. Fate, it seemed, had a particular fondness for irony. Charlotte, who happened to be in the room when Eleanor read the letter, noticed the sudden stillness that fell over her employer. "What is it?" she asked, setting down the ledger she had been reviewing. "An invitation," Eleanor said slowly, "to a trade summit, hosted by the Whitmore family." Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "Is that not the same family that once had a hand in ending your engagement?" "The very same," Eleanor said. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The mill continued its steady hum outside the office door, the sound of dozens of looms working in rhythm, a sound that had become as familiar to Eleanor as her own heartbeat over the past year. "Will you attend?" Charlotte finally asked. Eleanor looked down at the letter again, at the elegant script requesting her presence, at the seal bearing the Whitmore family crest, the same crest she had once seen stamped on invitations she received as Julian's intended bride, back when she still believed that love and family approval walked hand in hand. "Yes," Eleanor said, and there was something new in her voice, something certain and unshaken. "I will attend." She spent the following weeks preparing with the same meticulous care she applied to every important decision in her business. She reviewed every detail of the shipping partnership the Whitmore family was proposing, understanding precisely what value her mill could offer them, and precisely what value she expected in return. She did not intend to walk into that estate as a supplicant hoping for approval. She intended to walk in as an equal, someone whose success spoke louder than any title or family name ever could. She also made a decision that surprised even Nathaniel, who had grown accustomed to representing the mill at important meetings while Eleanor worked behind the scenes. This time, she informed him, she would attend the summit herself. "Are you certain?" Nathaniel asked, some concern evident in his voice. "The Whitmore family and their associates are not always welcoming toward business conducted by women. You have built this mill's reputation carefully. I would not want a single meeting to undo any of that progress." "I understand the risk," Eleanor said, "but I have spent enough of my life allowing others to speak on my behalf, whether by choice or by necessity. This is my mill. I built it with my own hands and my own mind. If the Whitmore family wishes to do business with Hartley and Bellamy Textiles, they will do business with its owner directly. The morning of the summit arrived cold and bright, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the countryside look as though it had been freshly painted. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a dress of deep green wool, fine but not extravagant, the kind of garment that spoke of quiet confidence rather than desperate attempts to impress. She had learned, over the past year, that true authority did not require ornamentation. It required only the steady certainty of someone who knew exactly what she had accomplished and exactly what she was worth. The carriage ride to the Whitmore estate felt strangely different from the last time she had traveled that same road, over a year earlier, arriving as a nervous young woman hoping to be accepted into a family that had never truly wanted her. This time, she rode with a leather folder containing carefully prepared documents outlining her mill's production capacity, its growing list of contracts, and the terms under which she would consider a partnership. This time, she rode not as someone seeking approval, but as someone offering opportunity. The estate looked exactly as she remembered it, grand and imposing, its stone walls rising against the pale autumn sky. Carriages lined the long drive, belonging to merchants, manufacturers, and traders from across the region, all gathered for the same purpose she had come for. Eleanor stepped down from her own carriage, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the entrance with the same steady, unwavering pace she used when walking the floor of her own mill. Inside, the grand hall had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables arranged with samples of goods from various businesses, groups of well-dressed men and a scattering of women moving between them, discussing figures, negotiating terms, exchanging the kind of polite but purposeful conversation that filled every trade gathering Eleanor had ever attended. She found the table designated for Hartley and Bellamy Textiles, near the center of the hall, a location that told her the organizers considered her mill's presence significant enough to warrant prominent placement. She arranged her samples of finished cloth carefully, the fine, consistent weave that had built her reputation, and waited for the summit to formally begin. It was nearly an hour into the gathering when she first sensed a shift in the room, a subtle ripple of attention moving through the crowd. She looked up to see Duke Alexander Whitmore entering the hall, tall and composed, greeting guests with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, though her expression remained perfectly calm. She had known, of course, that attending a summit hosted by the Whitmore family meant she would eventually encounter Alexander himself. She had prepared herself for this moment during every one of those long weeks leading up to the summit, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it settle into her chest as the man himself walked closer were two entirely different experiences. Alexander moved through the hall, exchanging brief words with various merchants, his attention clearly focused on identifying which businesses might prove most valuable to his family's shipping interests. Eleanor watched him approach, table by table, drawing steadily closer to her own, and she straightened her posture, folded her hands calmly in front of her, and waited. When he finally reached her table, his eyes moved first to the samples of cloth laid out before him, running his fingers briefly across the fine weave, with the practiced assessment of someone who understood quality when he saw it. Then his eyes moved upward, to the woman standing behind the display, and Eleanor watched, with a strange, satisfying calm, as recognition slowly dawned across his face. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. His hand, still resting on the cloth, went still. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as though trying to reconcile the composed, successful businesswoman standing before him with the quiet young woman he had once dismissed so carelessly over dinner. "Miss Hartley," he finally said, his voice noticeably less steady than the confident tone he had used with every other merchant in the hall. "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice perfectly even, betraying none of the emotions churning beneath her calm exterior. "It has been some time." "I was not aware," Alexander began, then paused, seeming to search for the right words, "that Hartley and Bellamy Textiles belong to you." "There is a great deal, Your Grace, that you were not aware of," Eleanor said, and though her tone remained polite, there was an unmistakable edge beneath the words, sharp enough that Alexander flinched slightly at the sound of it. Around them, the ordinary noise of the trade summit continued, merchants discussing figures, buyers examining goods, the low hum of commerce filling the grand hall. But between Eleanor and Alexander, a different kind of silence had settled, heavy with everything unspoken, everything neither of them had expected to confront on this ordinary autumn afternoon. Alexander cleared his throat, visibly attempting to regain the composure that had defined his every public appearance since childhood. "This is," he said carefully, "remarkable work, truly remarkable. I had heard whispers of a mill producing exceptional cloth, but I confess I did not connect the reputation to anyone I knew personally." "You did not know me personally," Eleanor said simply. "You knew of me. There is a difference, Your Grace, one I suspect you have never had occasion to consider before." The words landed exactly as she intended, precise and unmistakable, carrying the full weight of everything she had built since the night his careless comment changed the entire course of her life. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something flickered across his composed expression, something that might have been the beginning of genuine discomfort, or perhaps even the earliest, most reluctant stirrings of respect. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it above the surrounding noise. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing his words, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity. She found none, only a kind of uncertain honesty that she had not expected from the man who had once spoken so carelessly about her worth. "An apology," she said finally, "is a fine thing to offer, Your Grace, but I did not come here today seeking one. I came here to discuss a business partnership, if your family remains interested in one, or to simply demonstrate the quality of what my mill produces, if you are not. Whatever apologies you feel compelled to offer, I would ask that you save them for a moment, when I am not standing in a room full of your associates, wondering whether the words are meant sincerely, or simply meant to smooth over an awkward encounter." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, an expression Eleanor had never once seen on his face during the brief, painful months she had known him as her almost brother-in-law. It looked, unmistakably, like genuine respect. "Then let us discuss the partnership," he said finally. "On whatever terms you believe are fair, Miss Hartley. I suspect, after everything I am beginning to understand about you, that your terms will prove entirely reasonable." Eleanor allowed herself a small, private smile, the first genuine one she had offered since walking into this hall. "We shall see, Your Grace," she said. "We shall see." News of the encounter at the trade summit spread through the county faster than Eleanor could have anticipated, though not in the way she might have expected. It was not scandal that carried her name from household to household this time, but admiration, whispered first among the merchants who had witnessed the exchange, then repeated in drawing rooms and dining halls until it reached ears far beyond the borders of the summit itself. They said Miss Hartley had stood before the Duke of Whitmore without flinching, that she had spoken to him as an equal rather than a subordinate, that she had built an entire textile empire from nothing, while the family that once dismissed her looked on in stunned silence. Some of the details grew exaggerated in the retelling, as gossip always does, but the core of the story remained true enough that Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her life, the subject of admiration rather than pity or dismissal. She returned to the mill the following morning, with the signed terms of a new shipping partnership tucked carefully into her leather folder, terms that would allow her products to reach markets far beyond what she had previously managed to secure. It was, by any measure, an enormous professional victory, and yet, as she sat in her office reviewing the documents, she found her thoughts returning, again and again, to the look on Alexander's face when he first recognized her, the way his composed certainty had crumbled so completely, in the span of a single moment. She told herself it meant nothing beyond the satisfaction of having proven him wrong. She told herself this several times over the following days, each time with slightly less conviction than before. Charlotte, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in her employer's mood almost immediately. "You have been distracted since your return from the summit," she observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the mill, inspecting a newly installed set of looms. "I have a great deal on my mind," Eleanor replied, though the answer felt incomplete even to her own ears. Charlotte gave her a knowing look but said nothing further, understanding that some matters were best left for her employer to sort through in her own time. The shipping partnership required regular correspondence between Eleanor's mill and the Whitmore family's business interests, correspondence that Eleanor had assumed would be handled primarily through intermediaries, much as her earlier dealings with London buyers had been managed through Nathaniel Cross. She was therefore surprised, and more unsettled than she cared to admit, when the first letter regarding the partnership's logistics arrived not from a Whitmore family representative, but from Alexander himself. The letter was formal in tone, discussing shipping schedules and cargo capacity, with the same precision Eleanor herself brought to her business correspondence. But woven throughout the practical details were small, unexpected touches, a brief comment praising the quality of the cloth samples he had examined at the summit, a question about how she had managed to rebuild the mill's machinery so effectively in such a short span of time. It was not the letter of a man simply managing business logistics. It was the letter of a man genuinely curious about the woman he had once dismissed so completely. Eleanor read the letter twice before setting it aside, uncertain how to feel about the unexpected warmth beneath its formal language. She drafted a reply that addressed the practical matters directly and professionally, deliberately avoiding any response to his more personal questions. She was not ready, she told herself, to engage with Alexander Whitmore as anything more than a business partner. The wounds he had caused, however unintentionally overheard, had cut deep enough that professional courtesy felt like more than sufficient generosity on her part. But Alexander, it seemed, was not so easily deterred. His next letter arrived within the week, again addressing the practical matters of their partnership, but also including a more direct acknowledgement of their shared history. "I have thought often," he wrote, "about the words I spoke that evening, words I never imagined would reach the ears of the person they concerned. I offer no excuse for them, only the honest admission that I was wrong, more thoroughly and completely wrong than I have been about most things in my life. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I write this letter seeking it. I write only because I believe you deserve to know that I recognize the harm my careless words caused, and that watching you build something so remarkable in spite of them has forced me to reconsider a great many assumptions I once held without question." Eleanor sat with this letter for a long time, reading it over and over, searching for some hint of insincerity or manipulation, some sign that this was simply a wealthy man attempting to smooth over an uncomfortable situation for his own convenience. But the words felt genuine, in a way she had not expected, carrying none of the practiced charm she associated with men of his social standing. She did not reply immediately. Instead, she spent several days focused entirely on the mill, throwing herself into the practical demands of managing an expanding business, as though sufficient distraction might allow her to avoid confronting the complicated feelings his letter had stirred within her. It was Julian, unexpectedly, who forced the matter into the open. He arrived at the mill one afternoon without warning, his carriage pulling up outside the gates, just as Eleanor was reviewing production figures with Charlotte. She had not seen him since the brief, formal letter that ended their engagement over a year earlier, and the sight of him standing awkwardly near the entrance, hat in hand, sent a strange jolt of surprise through her chest. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she remembered from their courtship, only a kind of careful, uncertain formality. "I hope I am not intruding." "You are always welcome to visit, Lord Julian," Eleanor said, though her tone made clear this was a courtesy rather than genuine enthusiasm. "What brings you here?" Julian glanced around the mill floor, taking in the busy scene of workers and machinery, an expression of genuine surprise crossing his features as he absorbed the scale of what Eleanor had built. "I confess," he said slowly, "I did not fully understand, until recently, just how remarkable this operation has become." "Your brother offered similar sentiments at the trade summit," Eleanor replied evenly. Julian's expression tightened slightly at the mention of Alexander. "That is, in part, why I have come," he admitted. "I wish to speak with you honestly, about everything that happened between us, and about the role my brother played in ending what we had begun together." Eleanor set down the ledger she had been holding, and gave Julian her full attention. "Then speak honestly, Lord Julian. I would welcome nothing less." "I allowed my brother's opinion to matter more than my own feelings," Julian said, his voice heavy with something that sounded genuinely close to regret. "I told myself at the time that I was simply being practical, that family approval mattered more than personal happiness. But the truth is that I did not fight for you as I should have. I let you go without ever telling you how deeply I regretted the decision, even as I was making it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, feeling a strange mixture of emotions she had not anticipated. Sympathy for the young man standing before her, mixed with a clear certainty that whatever she had once felt for him belonged firmly to a past she had no interest in revisiting. "I appreciate your honesty, Julian," she said finally. And I do not hold the past against you the way I once might have. But I must tell you plainly, so there is no confusion between us, that I have built an entirely new life since that letter arrived. A life I am proud of. A life that no longer has room for regrets about what might have been between us. Julian nodded slowly, and Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of relief cross his features, as though he had come expecting a far more painful confrontation, and found, instead, a measure of peace he had not anticipated. I am glad, he said quietly. Truly glad, Miss Hartley, to see how far you have come. You deserve every bit of this success. Thank you, Julian, Eleanor said, and meant it sincerely. As he prepared to leave, Julian paused near the door, turning back to face her one final time. I should tell you, he said carefully, that my brother speaks of you often. More often, I think, than he realizes himself. I do not say this to influence whatever decisions you make going forward. I say it only because I believe you deserve to know the full truth of the situation, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge. Eleanor said nothing in response, watching Julian's carriage disappear down the road, his words settling uncomfortably into her thoughts, forcing her to confront feelings she had spent weeks carefully avoiding. That evening, she sat down at her desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and finally composed her reply to Alexander's letter, choosing her words with the same careful precision she applied to every important decision in her life. I accept your apology, she wrote, though acceptance does not mean forgetting. I have built something meaningful from the pain your words once caused me, and I do not regret the journey that pain set into motion, however unintentional its beginning. If you wish to continue our correspondence beyond the practical matters of our business partnership, I am willing to consider it, cautiously, and on terms that respect everything I have built since we last knew each other. She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself, and sent it the following morning, uncertain exactly where this new correspondence might lead, but certain, for the first time since that painful night at the Whitmore dinner table, that she was ready to find out. Fire broke out in the storage wing of the mill on a windswept night in late autumn, and Eleanor was pulled from sleep by the frantic pounding of Charlotte's fist against her front door, the older woman's face lit orange by the glow visible even from a distance. Eleanor threw on her coat and ran the entire way to the mill, her heart pounding harder with every step, terror gripping her chest at the thought of losing everything she had built in a single catastrophic night. By the time she arrived, workers had already formed a chain, passing buckets of water from the nearby well toward the storage building, where flames licked hungrily at stacks of raw cotton and finished cloth. Eleanor threw herself into the effort without hesitation, working alongside her employees through the chaos and smoke, coordinating their efforts with a clear head, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. It took nearly 2 hours to bring the fire fully under control, and by the time the last embers were doused, the storage wing lay in ruins, along with a significant portion of that season's finished inventory. Eleanor stood in the wreckage as dawn began to break, exhaustion and grief warring within her, staring at the smoking remains of months of careful, painstaking work. Charlotte found her there, her face streaked with soot and something close to tears. It could have been worse, Charlotte said quietly. The main production floor is untouched. We can rebuild the storage wing. I know, Eleanor said, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. I know that we can rebuild. But someone did this deliberately, Charlotte. This was no accident. An investigation, conducted quietly by a hired inspector Eleanor trusted, confirmed her suspicions within days. The fire had been deliberately set, using materials that suggested careful planning rather than careless accident. Eleanor thought immediately of the rival textile company that had caused her trouble with the seized dye shipment months earlier, though she had no direct proof connecting them to this latest, far more devastating attack. The news of the fire reached Alexander within a day, carried through the same channels of trade gossip that had once carried whispers of Eleanor's remarkable rise. He arrived at the mill unannounced the following morning, dressed simply, rather than in the formal attire she associated with his public appearances, his expression tight with genuine concern. I came as soon as I heard, he said, standing amid the ruins of the storage wing, surveying the damage with an expression of real distress. Are you unharmed? I am unharmed, Eleanor said, too exhausted and heartsick to maintain the guarded distance she had carefully cultivated in their recent correspondence. But we have lost a great deal, Alexander. Months of inventory, Contracts I will now struggle to fulfill, the trust of buyers who will hear of this fire and wonder whether my operation is stable enough to rely upon. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying the wreckage before turning back to face her directly. "Let me help," he said simply. Eleanor shook her head immediately, old instincts of pride and self-reliance rising sharply within her. "I did not build this business to have it rescued by the very family that once dismissed it entirely. I am not offering rescue," Alexander said firmly. "I am offering partnership, the same partnership I have been asking you to consider through every letter I have written these past weeks. My family's shipping resources could help you secure replacement materials faster than any alternate supplier you might find on your own. This is not charity, Eleanor. This is exactly the kind of arrangement any two business partners would extend to one another in a moment of crisis." Eleanor studied him carefully, weighing his offer against her fierce independence, against the memory of every moment she had spent building this business entirely through her own effort and determination. But practicality, ultimately, won out over pride. She could not allow sentiment, whether wounded or otherwise, to jeopardize everything she had worked so hard to protect. "Very well," she said finally. "I will accept your help, on the condition that it remains a business arrangement, documented and formal, like any other partnership agreement." Alexander nodded, something that looked almost like relief crossing his features. "Agreed," he said. Over the following weeks, Alexander proved as good as his word, using his family's extensive shipping network to secure emergency materials at remarkably favorable rates, allowing Eleanor to rebuild her damaged inventory far faster than she could have managed alone. He visited the mill regularly during this period, ostensibly to oversee the logistics of their partnership, though Eleanor gradually noticed that his visits often extended well beyond what practical necessity required. They spent hours together reviewing shipping schedules and production timelines, and somewhere within those long working sessions, something began to shift between them, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation she was reluctant to fully acknowledge, even to herself. Alexander, for his part, seemed equally unable to maintain the strictly professional distance he had initially proposed, his questions gradually straying from matters of business into more personal territory, his attention lingering a moment too long whenever Eleanor spoke with the passionate certainty that defined everything she did. One evening, as they sat together in her office, reviewing the final details of the rebuilt storage wing's construction, Alexander set down his pen and looked at her directly, an unusual seriousness settling over his features. "I owe you a more complete apology than the one I offered at the trade summit," he said quietly. "Not simply for the words I spoke that night at dinner, though those remain inexcusable. I owe you an apology for every assumption I carried before that night as well, every careless judgment I made about people I considered beneath my notice, simply because they lacked a title or a fortune equal to my own. Watching you rebuild this mill, watching you handle every crisis with more grace and determination than I have shown in situations far less demanding, has forced me to understand exactly how wrong I was, not just about you, but about an entire way of viewing the world that I inherited without ever questioning it." Eleanor listened to this admission in silence, feeling the weight of genuine transformation behind his words, a transformation that felt entirely different from the polished apologies of a man simply trying to smooth over past mistakes for his own comfort. "That is a significant admission, Your Grace," she said finally, though her voice had softened considerably from the guarded tone she had maintained during their earliest exchanges. "If we are to move beyond formal titles, I would ask that you call me Alexander." Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar unfurl within her chest at the request, a feeling she had carefully guarded against for so long that its sudden presence caught her entirely off guard. "Alexander," she repeated softly, testing the name in a new context, one that carried none of the coldness she associated with the voice she had once overheard through a dining room door. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the practical matters of their business partnership forgotten entirely, replaced by something far more delicate and uncertain, something neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, but something both of them recognized as unmistakably real. The letter that arrived from the rival textile company owner, a sharp-tongued man named George Ashford, contained no pleasantries and no attempt at diplomatic language. It arrived on Eleanor's desk on a gray winter morning, and its contents made her blood run cold before she had even finished reading the first paragraph. Ashford wrote plainly, without disguising his intentions, that he was aware of certain irregularities in the original purchase agreement between Eleanor and Arthur Bellamy. Irregularities he claimed could be used to challenge her ownership of the mill entirely. He suggested, in language that stopped just short of outright threat, that she might wish to consider selling a controlling share of her business to his company at a significantly reduced price, rather than risk a costly and public legal battle over the mill's true ownership. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it down, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and genuine fear. She had reviewed every document related to the mill's purchase countless times over the past year, confident that everything had been handled properly and legally. But the confidence born of careful preparation could not entirely silence the anxious voice, reminding her how easily powerful men had destroyed the futures of women, with far less to lose than she currently possessed. She brought the letter immediately to her lawyer, a careful, methodical man named Oliver Pemberton, who had handled her affairs since the original purchase of the mill. Oliver reviewed the letter with a frown deepening across his features, then spent the following 2 days examining every document connected to the original transaction with meticulous care. "There are no irregularities," Oliver finally told her, relief evident in his voice as he delivered the news. "The purchase was conducted entirely properly. Mr. Ashford is attempting to intimidate you with claims that have no legal foundation whatsoever." "Then why would he risk sending such a letter?" Eleanor asked, still troubled despite Oliver's reassurance. "Because intimidation often works," Oliver said grimly. "Many people, faced with the threat of a costly legal battle, choose to settle rather than fight, even when the underlying claims against them are entirely baseless. Mr. Ashford is gambling that you will make the same choice." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, anger slowly replacing the fear that had gripped her since first reading Ashford's letter. "Then he has gambled incorrectly," she said finally. "I did not build this mill by backing away from every difficult challenge that crossed my path. I do not intend to start now." She drafted a careful, measured response to Ashford, informing him that her lawyer had confirmed the complete legality of her ownership, and that any further attempts at intimidation would be met with an immediate legal complaint regarding harassment and attempted extortion. She sent the letter with a steady hand, though privately she remained uncertain whether Ashford would truly back down or escalate his campaign against her. When she told Alexander about the situation during his next visit to the mill, his expression darkened with an anger she had never before witnessed in him, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "I know Ashford," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "He has a reputation for exactly this kind of behavior, preying on smaller operations he believes lack the resources to fight back. He miscalculated badly if he believed you would prove an easy target. He may still cause significant trouble, regardless of the legal merits of his claims," Eleanor said. "Men like him often have connections and resources that allow them to make life difficult for their competitors, even when they cannot win outright. Then he will discover that you no longer stand alone against such difficulties," Alexander said firmly. "My family's influence extends into circles that even Ashford would think twice about crossing. I will speak with several associates who share business interests with his company. I suspect his willingness to continue this harassment will diminish considerably once he understands the full weight of opposition he has invited." Eleanor studied him carefully, torn between her fierce independence and genuine gratitude for the protection he was offering. "I do not wish to rely on your family's influence to solve every problem that arises in my business," she said slowly. "I am not suggesting you rely on it for every problem," Alexander replied gently. "I am suggesting that when someone attempts to harm you through means entirely divorced from fair competition, using threats and intimidation rather than honest business practices, it is not weakness to accept support from someone who cares about your well-being. There is a difference, Eleanor, between needing rescue and choosing to accept help freely offered by someone who believes in what you have built." The words, and the evident sincerity behind them, settled something uncertain within Eleanor's chest. "Very well," she said finally. "I will accept your help with this particular matter. But only this matter, Alexander. I still intend to fight my own battles whenever I am capable of doing so." "I would expect nothing less from you," Alexander said, and there was something in his expression, warm and unmistakably admiring, that made Eleanor's heart beat a little faster, despite the tension of the situation surrounding them. True to his word, Alexander's intervention proved remarkably effective. Within 2 weeks, Ashford sent a brief, considerably more contrite letter, withdrawing his earlier claims entirely, and expressing what he called a renewed respect for the legitimacy of Hartley and Bellamy Textiles as an established and reputable business operation. Eleanor suspected strongly that this sudden change of heart owed far more to whatever conversations Alexander had conducted behind the scenes than to any genuine reconsideration on Ashford's part. But she found herself, for the first time, unbothered by accepting assistance that had been so clearly offered, out of genuine care, rather than any attempt to diminish her own accomplishments. As winter deepened and the immediate crisis with Ashford faded into memory, Eleanor found herself spending increasing amounts of time with Alexander, their conversations drifting further from matters of business into territory that felt increasingly personal, increasingly significant. He began arriving at the mill not with official correspondence requiring her attention, but simply to see her, bringing small gifts on occasion, books he thought she might enjoy, a particularly fine bolt of silk from a supplier he thought might interest her for future production. Their growing closeness did not escape the notice of those around them. Charlotte watched the developing relationship with quiet approval, occasionally offering Eleanor knowing looks whenever Alexander's carriage appeared at the mill gates. Even Julian, during a brief visit to discuss unrelated family business, remarked with genuine warmth on how different his brother seemed since his regular visits to the mill began, describing him as more thoughtful, more considerate, more genuinely present than Julian had witnessed in years. Eleanor found herself, despite every carefully guarded instinct developed since that painful night overhearing Alexander's cruel dismissal, slowly allowing herself to trust the sincerity of his transformation. It was not blind trust, not the naive faith she had once placed in Julian's affections, before understanding how easily family pressure could dissolve even genuine feelings. It was a trust, built carefully, through months of watching Alexander demonstrate consistent respect for her independence, genuine admiration for her accomplishments, and a willingness to acknowledge and learn from his earlier mistakes, rather than simply asking her to forget them entirely. She was beginning, cautiously, and against every instinct that told her to guard her heart more carefully, after everything she had endured, to fall in love with the very man whose careless words had once set this entire remarkable journey into motion. The Dowager Duchess, Alexander's mother, a formidable woman named Beatrice Whitmore, arrived unannounced at the mill on a bitterly cold afternoon, her carriage bearing the family crest that Eleanor had once found so intimidating during her brief courtship with Julian. Eleanor received her in the small parlor adjacent to her office, uncertain what to expect from this unexpected visit, her stomach tightening with an old, familiar anxiety she had believed she left behind long ago. Beatrice settled herself into a chair with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life commanding rooms simply by entering them, her sharp eyes surveying Eleanor's parlor with an assessment that felt both critical and curious in equal measure. "You have built quite an operation here, Miss Hartley," Beatrice said finally, her tone giving away nothing of her true feelings about the visit. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor replied carefully. Beatrice studied her for a long moment before continuing. "My son speaks of you often, more often than is entirely proper for a man in his position speaking of a woman he has not yet formally courted. I have come to understand exactly what has captured his attention so thoroughly." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, uncertain whether this conversation was leading toward approval or condemnation. "And what conclusion have you reached, Your Grace?" she asked, choosing directness over the careful evasion she might once have employed in a similar situation. "I have concluded," Beatrice said, a faint smile finally softening her stern expression, "that you are precisely the kind of woman my family has needed for generations. Someone with genuine substance rather than mere pedigree, someone who builds rather than simply inherits. I confess, when Alexander first mentioned his growing regard for you, I harbored significant reservations, remembering the circumstances under which your engagement to Julian ended. But watching what you have accomplished here, hearing how thoroughly you have earned the respect of everyone who does business with you, I find those reservations have entirely dissolved." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash through her, followed almost immediately by a flicker of old anger she had not expected to resurface so sharply. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said carefully, "but I find myself somewhat troubled by how easily my worth seems to shift in the eyes of your family. depending entirely on how successful my business becomes. I was the same woman, with the same character and the same capabilities, on the night your son declared me not worth noticing. The only difference between that woman and the one sitting before you now is a mill full of machinery and a growing list of contracts. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor wondered if she had spoken too boldly, risking whatever fragile approval this visit might have offered. But when Beatrice finally spoke again, her voice carried none of the offense Eleanor had feared. "You are entirely correct," Beatrice said quietly, "and that is, perhaps, the most damning indictment of my family's judgment that anyone has offered me in years. We valued title and fortune above genuine character for so long that we lost the ability to recognize true worth when it stood plainly before us. My son learned that lesson through considerable personal humiliation. I am learning it now, somewhat more comfortably, through this conversation with you. I hope you will forgive an old woman for arriving late to a wisdom you possessed from the very beginning." Eleanor felt something shift within her chest, an old wound beginning, finally, to close over completely. "I appreciate your honesty, Your Grace," she said softly. "It means more than you likely realize." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, moving gradually from the weight of past grievances into lighter territory, Beatrice asking genuine questions about the mill's operations, about Eleanor's plans for future expansion, about the challenges and triumphs of building something entirely her own. By the time Beatrice finally rose to leave, something had genuinely shifted between them, the beginning of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than the strained courtesy Eleanor had once endured during her brief engagement to Julian. "I hope you will visit the estate again soon, Miss Hartley," Beatrice said as she prepared to depart. "Not as a guest attending a trade summit, but as someone I would genuinely welcome into our family's company." Eleanor watched the Duchess's carriage depart, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions settling within her. Relief and cautious hope mixed with the lingering awareness of everything she had endured to arrive at this unexpected moment. That evening, Alexander arrived at the mill later than usual, his expression carrying a nervousness Eleanor had rarely witnessed in him. "My mother visited you today," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her desk. "She did," Eleanor confirmed. "It was, ultimately, a productive conversation." Alexander nodded, though his nervousness did not entirely fade. "I asked her to visit," he admitted. "I wanted to know her true feelings before I asked you something I have been considering for some time now." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, understanding intuitively where this conversation was heading, though she remained silent, waiting for him to continue in his own time. Alexander rose from his chair and moved to stand before her desk, his usual composed confidence replaced by something far more vulnerable and genuine. "Eleanor," he said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "I have spent the past several months watching you rebuild everything I once so carelessly dismissed, watching you handle every crisis with more courage and integrity than I have ever managed to demonstrate myself. Somewhere during those months, my admiration for what you have built became something far deeper, something I did not expect and initially struggled to fully understand. I love you, Eleanor, not despite everything that happened between us, but in part because of the remarkable woman that difficult chapter revealed you to be." Eleanor stood slowly, meeting his gaze directly, feeling the full weight of everything they had endured together settling into this single, significant moment. "I love you as well, Alexander," she said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and entirely true as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "Though I confess, there remains a part of me that struggles to reconcile the man standing before me now with the voice I once overheard through a dining room door. I am not that same man," Alexander said firmly. "I have not been that man for a very long time now, and I intend to spend whatever years remain to me proving that transformation was genuine, rather than simply convenient." "Then prove it," Eleanor said, a small, tentative smile finally breaking across her features, "not through grand declarations, but through the same steady, consistent respect you have shown me these past several months. That is the only proof I require." Alexander reached for her hand, and Eleanor allowed him to take it, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing gently around her own, a warmth that felt, finally, like the beginning of something genuine and lasting, rather than the fragile hope she had once placed in his younger brother's uncertain affections. "I intend to do exactly that," Alexander said softly, "for as long as you will allow me the privilege." News of Alexander's intentions toward Eleanor spread through the county with remarkable speed, and not everyone received the news with the warmth Beatrice had eventually offered. A distant cousin of the Whitmore family, a sharp-tongued woman named Rosalind Fairweather, who had long harbored her own ambitions of securing Alexander's affections for her own daughter, arrived at a winter gathering, determined to undermine Eleanor's growing standing before it could solidify any further. The gathering, a modest ball hosted by one of the county's respected families, brought together much of the same social circle that had once witnessed Eleanor's quiet humiliation during her brief engagement to Julian. Eleanor arrived on Alexander's arm, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Charlotte had helped her select, feeling a confidence in that grand hall that stood in stark contrast to the uncertain young woman she had once been within these same social circles. Rosalind approached them within the first hour of the evening, her smile sharp and calculated beneath a veneer of polite courtesy. "Miss Hartley," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding guests. "How remarkable to see you here, given the circumstances under which you last departed our social gatherings. I do hope your business ventures have not distracted you too thoroughly from remembering your proper place among company such as this." Eleanor felt the old sting of such words, the familiar instinct to shrink smaller, to apologize for daring to occupy space in a room full of people who considered themselves her betters. But that instinct, so deeply ingrained during her earlier years, had been thoroughly reshaped by everything she had accomplished since the night Alexander's careless words first set her on this remarkable path. "I have not forgotten my place at all, Mrs. Fairweather," Eleanor replied evenly, her voice carrying clearly across the surrounding conversation. "My place, as it happens, is precisely wherever I have chosen to build it, whether that be the floor of a thriving textile mill or the hall of a formal gathering such as this one. I find I am no longer troubled by attempts to convince me otherwise." A ripple of surprised amusement moved through the small crowd that had gathered to witness the exchange, and Rosalind's confident smile faltered slightly at the unexpected boldness of Eleanor's response. She glanced toward Alexander, clearly hoping for some intervention on his part that might restore the social order she believed should govern such interactions. Alexander, rather than offering the deference Rosalind seemed to expect, simply smiled and tightened his hand gently around Eleanor's arm. "I find myself in complete agreement with Miss Hartley's assessment," he said smoothly, "though I would add that her place has proven, time and again, to be considerably more valuable to this county than the idle gossip that occupies so much of our social gatherings." The exchange, brief as it was, marked a decisive shift in how the surrounding society viewed Eleanor's presence among them. Where once she had been quietly dismissed, tolerated at best due to her connection to the Whitmore family, she now commanded genuine attention and respect, her sharp wit and evident accomplishments earning admiration from guests who had previously overlooked her entirely. Rosalind, recognizing the futility of her attempted humiliation, retreated with as much dignity as she could muster, though Eleanor noticed the woman spent the remainder of the evening carefully avoiding any further direct engagement with either herself or Alexander. Later that evening, as they stepped outside onto the estate's expansive terrace for a brief respite from the crowded ballroom, Alexander turned to Eleanor with genuine admiration evident in his expression. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "I confess, watching you stand your ground so completely against someone who once might have reduced you to silence, I find my admiration for you growing by the hour." "I have had considerable practice standing my ground these past 2 years," Eleanor replied, a small smile playing at her lips. "Though, I admit, it still requires effort, even now, to resist the old instinct to simply shrink away from confrontation." "That instinct will fade further with time," Alexander said gently. "And regardless of how much effort it requires, I hope you know that I will always stand beside you when such moments arise, not to fight your battles for you, but simply to remind you that you no longer face them alone." Eleanor leaned against the terrace railing, looking out over the darkened gardens below, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her that she had not experienced since long before that painful night overhearing Alexander's careless dismissal. "I never imagined," she said softly, "that the very words meant to diminish me would eventually lead me here, standing beside the man who spoke them, feeling more valued and respected than I ever believed possible." Alexander moved to stand beside her, taking her hand gently in his own. "Nor did I imagine," he admitted, "that a single careless comment, spoken without any true understanding of who you were, would eventually humble me so thoroughly, teaching me lessons about genuine worth that no amount of privilege or education had managed to instill in me before that night. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, the sounds of the ball continuing behind them, muffled and distant, as though the world beyond this quiet terrace had temporarily faded into insignificance. "I have a question for you," Alexander said finally, breaking the silence with a nervousness that seemed almost endearing, coming from a man normally so composed and certain in every public setting. "Though I fear the timing may seem sudden to some, I find myself entirely certain of what I wish to ask." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of anticipation and joy she made no attempt to hide. "Then ask," she said softly. Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring, far simpler than Eleanor might have expected from a man of his considerable wealth and standing. A modest but beautifully crafted piece that spoke of genuine thoughtfulness rather than ostentatious display. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice steady, despite the evident emotion behind his words. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not as compensation for past wrongs, and not as a symbol of how thoroughly you have proven your worth to a family that once failed to recognize it, but simply because I love you, entirely and completely, for exactly who you are?" Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, tears born not of the old pain that had once defined so much of her journey, but of a happiness so profound it nearly overwhelmed her entirely. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts at composure, and then drew her into an embrace that felt, finally, like the true beginning of everything she had once believed impossible, standing frozen and humiliated outside a dining room door that now felt like a memory from an entirely different lifetime. The announcement of Eleanor and Alexander's engagement traveled through the county with even greater speed than the earlier rumors of their growing closeness, and the reactions it provoked varied considerably depending on who received the news. Most of the merchants and traders who had come to know and respect Eleanor through her business dealings expressed genuine delight, recognizing in this union a validation of everything they had come to admire about her character and determination. Among the more traditional members of the county's aristocratic families, however, the reaction proved considerably more complicated. Eleanor found herself, in the weeks following the engagement, navigating an entirely new set of social expectations, learning to move within circles that had once dismissed her entirely as she prepared to become not just a successful businesswoman, but the future Duchess of Whitmore. It was, in many ways, a return to territory she had once found intimidating and unwelcoming, though she approached it now with a confidence and self-assurance that made an enormous difference in how she experienced every interaction. Her father, Henry, watched his daughter's transformation with a pride so evident it brought tears to his eyes on more than one occasion. "I never imagined," he told her one evening, sitting together in the same study where she had once read Julian's letter ending their engagement, "that I would live to see you achieve such remarkable success, both in business and in matters of the heart. Your mother would have been so proud of everything you have become." Eleanor felt a familiar ache at the mention of her mother, who had passed just months before the engagement was announced, never quite living long enough to witness this particular chapter of her daughter's remarkable story unfold. "I wish she could have seen this, Father," Eleanor said softly. "I wish she could have known that everything worked out exactly as she once hoped it would, even if the path there looked nothing like either of us expected." "She would have known," Henry said gently. "Mothers always seem to know these things, somehow, regardless of whether they live to witness the final outcome themselves." The wedding preparations, once they began in earnest, brought their own set of challenges, requiring Eleanor to balance the demands of her thriving business with the elaborate expectations that accompanied marriage into one of the county's most prominent families. She insisted, despite considerable pressure from various family members eager to orchestrate an extravagant celebration befitting the Whitmore name, on a ceremony that remained true to her own values, one that honored both her humble beginnings and her remarkable achievements without descending into unnecessary excess. Beatrice, who had become a genuine ally, and even something approaching a friend over the months since her initial visit to the mill, supported Eleanor's vision entirely, often intervening on her behalf when other family members attempted to impose their own preferences onto the celebration. "Let her have the wedding she wants," Beatrice would say firmly, whenever such disputes arose. Eleanor has earned the right to define this occasion on her own terms, exactly as she has earned everything else in her remarkable life. Charlotte, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly promoted to full managing partner of the mill's daily operations, a role Eleanor felt confident in trusting to her, given the woman's years of loyal service and deep understanding of every aspect of the business. Eleanor did not intend to abandon her involvement in the mill entirely upon her marriage, understanding too well the value of everything she had built to ever fully step away from it. But she recognized the necessity of delegating certain daily responsibilities as her role within the Whitmore family expanded to include new obligations and opportunities. "You are certain you trust me with this responsibility?" Charlotte asked, genuine uncertainty evident in her voice as Eleanor outlined the expanded role she envisioned. "I trust no one more completely," Eleanor replied firmly. "You have stood beside me since the very first day I walked into this mill as its uncertain new owner. There is no one I would rather see leading these operations during whatever periods my attention must be divided between business and family obligations." As the wedding date approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment, from the humiliation of that overheard dinner conversation to the thriving business she had built through sheer determination, to the unexpected love that had grown between herself and the very man whose careless words had once caused her such profound pain. It felt, in quiet moments of reflection, almost impossible to fully comprehend how completely her life had transformed in such a relatively short span of time. Alexander, for his part, continued demonstrating the same consistent respect and genuine partnership that had gradually won her trust over the preceding months. He never once suggested that Eleanor should abandon or diminish her business ambitions in favor of the more traditional role expected of a duchess, understanding instinctively that her identity as a successful businesswoman formed an essential and non-negotiable part of who she was, a part he had come to love and admire rather than view as an obstacle to be managed or minimized. "I do not wish to marry a woman who exists only within the confines of my family's expectations," he told her one evening, as they discussed how she might continue managing the mill's most important decisions even after their marriage. "I wish to marry the woman who built an entire textile empire from the ashes of a broken engagement, who stood before me at that trade summit with more courage and dignity than I have witnessed from anyone else in my entire life. That woman does not disappear simply because we exchange vows, Eleanor. If anything, I hope our marriage allows her even greater opportunity to continue building whatever remarkable things she chooses to pursue." Eleanor felt, hearing these words, a profound gratitude for having found a partner who understood so completely what she needed, not simply affection or financial security, but genuine respect for the independence and ambition that defined her character just as thoroughly as any romantic feeling she carried for him. As winter finally began giving way to the first hints of spring, and the wedding date drew closer with each passing week, Eleanor found herself standing once more in the doorway of the mill's main floor, watching the familiar rhythm of dozens of looms working in steady harmony, the same sight that had once represented nothing but uncertain possibility, now standing as tangible proof of everything she had managed to accomplish. She thought back, as she often did during quiet moments like this one, to that painful night standing frozen outside a dining room door, listening to words meant to diminish her entirely. She no longer felt the sharp sting of humiliation when she remembered that moment. Instead, she felt something closer to gratitude, however strange that gratitude might have seemed to her at the time those words were first spoken. That single moment of cruelty had set into motion an entire chain of events that ultimately led her here, standing on the threshold of a business empire built entirely through her own determination and a genuine, hard-won love with a man who had proven, through consistent action rather than empty words, that people were indeed capable of profound and lasting change. She was not the same woman who had once believed her worth depended entirely on the approval of others. She had become someone who understood, with unshakable certainty, that her value had never truly been in question at all, only waiting to be recognized, first by herself, and eventually, by everyone else around her. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, the kind of gentle spring day that seemed to promise good fortune to everyone fortunate enough to witness it. Eleanor stood in a small dressing room adjoining the estate's grand chapel, watching Charlotte carefully arrange the final details of her gown, a beautifully simple design of ivory silk that reflected the same quiet elegance Eleanor had brought to every aspect of her remarkable journey. "You look every bit the Duchess you are about to become," Charlotte said softly, stepping back to admire her handiwork, "though I confess you looked equally remarkable standing on the mill floor in your working clothes, directing every aspect of that operation with the same quiet authority." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to squeeze Charlotte's hand warmly. "I could not have built any of this without you standing beside me from the very beginning. I hope you know how deeply grateful I remain for your loyalty and friendship." "The mill will still be there waiting for you," Charlotte said with a knowing smile, "once you return from wherever this new chapter of your life takes you. Though I suspect, knowing you as well as I do, that you will find your way back to those looms far sooner than anyone might expect from a new duchess." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound carrying none of the careful restraint she had once practiced during her earlier, more uncertain years. "You know me too well, Charlotte." Her father appeared at the door moments later, dressed in his finest formal attire, his eyes glistening with unmistakable emotion as he took in the sight of his daughter, transformed so completely from the heartbroken young woman who had once sat frozen in his study, reading a letter that ended her first engagement. "You are ready?" Henry asked softly, extending his arm to escort her toward the chapel. "I have been ready for this moment for longer than I fully realized," Eleanor replied, taking his arm with a steady hand. The chapel itself had been decorated simply but beautifully, arrangements of white and pale green flowers lining the aisle, sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the gathered guests, a remarkable mixture of society's most prominent families, alongside the merchants, workers, and business associates who had supported Eleanor throughout her remarkable rise. It was, in many ways, a perfect reflection of the life she had built, one that honored both her humble beginnings and her extraordinary achievements, without privileging one over the other. Alexander waited at the front of the chapel, dressed in formal attire that could not entirely contain the evident emotion in his expression, as he watched Eleanor walk toward him, her father proudly escorting her down the aisle. Beside him stood Julian, serving as his brother's chosen witness, his expression carrying genuine warmth and none of the awkward tension that might once have colored such a significant moment between them. As Eleanor reached the front of the chapel, and her father placed her hand gently into Alexander's, she caught sight of Beatrice seated in the front row, dabbing gently at her eyes with a handkerchief, her earlier reservations about this union having long since transformed into genuine, wholehearted approval. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of meaningful words and quiet emotion, vows exchanged with a sincerity that left few dry eyes among the gathered guests. When Alexander finally slipped a wedding band onto Eleanor's finger, joining the engagement ring she had worn proudly since that night on the terrace, she felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. The final piece of a journey that had begun with cruel words, spoken carelessly over a dinner she had not been invited to share. Following the ceremony, the celebration moved to the estate's grand hall, transformed for the occasion, with the same simple elegance that had characterized every choice Eleanor had made throughout the wedding preparations. As guests mingled and celebrated, Eleanor found herself standing briefly alone near one of the tall windows, taking a quiet moment to absorb everything this remarkable day represented. Alexander found her there moments later, slipping his arm gently around her waist as he joined her at the window. "A rather different scene than the one that first brought us together in this house," he observed softly. Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking the same thing, though I confess, I find myself deeply grateful for that painful night now, difficult as it was to endure at the time. Without it, I might never have discovered exactly what I was capable of building on my own. I will spend the rest of our lives together, making certain you never again doubt your own worth," Alexander said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I suspect, knowing you as well as I now do, that you have long since stopped needing anyone else's validation to understand exactly how remarkable you truly are." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression carrying the quiet confidence of a woman who had transformed profound humiliation into an extraordinary triumph through nothing but her own determination, intelligence, and unwavering resolve. "You are right," she said softly. "I no longer need anyone's validation. But I am deeply grateful, nonetheless, to have found someone who offers it so genuinely and so completely." As the celebration continued around them, filled with laughter and warmth from everyone who had witnessed and supported her remarkable journey, Eleanor allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply enjoy this moment of hard-won happiness. She thought briefly of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had once stood frozen outside a dining room door, certain that a single cruel comment had defined her entire worth. That woman felt, standing here now, like a distant memory belonging to an entirely different lifetime. In her place stood a woman who had built an extraordinary business from nothing but stubborn determination, who had earned the genuine respect of an entire community through hard work and unwavering integrity, and who had found, against every expectation, a love built on mutual admiration and consistent, demonstrated respect rather than empty declarations or fleeting infatuation. She was not worth noticing, a careless voice had once declared, certain those words would never reach the ears of the woman they were meant to diminish. That voice had been wrong, more completely and thoroughly wrong than its speaker could ever have imagined on that ordinary autumn evening. Eleanor Hartley, now Eleanor Whitmore, stood as living proof that true worth could never truly be diminished by the careless words of others, only temporarily obscured, waiting patiently for the right moment to shine through, with undeniable, remarkable clarity. And as the golden light of that perfect spring evening settled over the celebration, surrounded by everyone who had witnessed her extraordinary transformation, Eleanor understood, with unshakable certainty, that this remarkable comeback was not the end of her story, but simply the beginning of everything still waiting to unfold.